In this episode, we're answering some first home buyer finance questions. We'll be covering how long you need to be in a new job before you can apply for a loan, expat lending, how to manage the first home buyer trade-off between a higher borrowing capacity for an investment property versus forgoing first home buyer grants and timing a home purchase around a career change. We get a lot of questions from our Facebook group members that relate specifically to finance. And since we are not finance experts, and you know we always stay in our lane, we recommend speaking to an expert in their field. So Veronica teamed up with her elephant in the room co-host, Chris Bates, who is a mortgage broker, and asked him to answer these questions on your behalf. Over to Veronica and Chris.
So today I've taken a whole bunch of these questions and I brought them along to ask Chris because he's the mortgage expert, not us. So let's get stuck into them. The first question, this is a pretty basic one, but I actually think that the answer might be a bit more nuanced than maybe one may think on the surface. So this is the question, how long do I need to be in my new job before I can get pre-approval for a first home? And the person that asked this was said, in brackets, 16 years as a cop, now moving into factual investigations, husband, same job as COO for 20 plus years. So Chris, first, in this circumstance, what would you say would be the answer to the question? But also, can we broaden it out to different types of jobs and different types of career moves?
Look, I think the person I'm asking the question, thanks for it. It's not going to have any problems. But I think that to preface everything and add a bit of context with policy and how does it actually work is that every bank has their own policy, right? They all have their own income policy and their own credit policy towards what type of assets they'll lend on, etc. And they're not fixed. They're constantly changing. And sometimes banks are very risk adverse and sometimes they're quite aggressive. And just because something doesn't fit policy as well, it doesn't mean that you can't get an exception on file and the bank to say, I know our policy is out of probation. However, we'll accept that because this person is a good borrower, etc. And it really depends on the market. So I think, like you said around nuance, Veronica, is that things are always changing, right? So we're recording this in 2024. Banks are absolutely risk on. They're willing to make exceptions. They're willing to lend money, and if there's no real major issues, right? But if you go back to, say, 2018 or COVID, at the start of COVID, or even 2016, there's times when banks get really nervous and their risk rating, completely increases, right? And they're very hesitant to lend money and they ask a lot more questions. And so usually though, like what a bank wants to see, if it's a complete new industry, so let's say you were doing one job and then you've started to do a whole new job and you're on, particularly if it's a casual income, they'll usually want 6 months, right? If it's permanent part-time and you haven't done it before, they do get a little bit nervous. They want to see that maybe a few months into that journey, but maybe not the full probation if it's 6 months. But ultimately, they probably won't lend on a contract usually. They'll want to make sure you're in the job. Usually it's 2 pay slips, so they can get a full cycle of whatever the pay is. Because your first pay slip, maybe you worked, 6 days out of the fortnight, or you worked half the month, not the full month. So usually they want to see that second pay slip, which is a full pay. But they often don't care about probation. They which is pretty crazy, right? If you think from borrowing money is that you could be let go with 1 week's notice, anytime in probation, no problem. And the bank's willing to take that risk. But if you're a self-employed customer, they want to see 2 years financials. They want to, see all your tax returns. And, they want to see a lot for self-employed people. Whereas, someone on a probation could be sacked tomorrow. So that's the general situation. If you're doing a career change, if it's very obvious and the banks are very hesitant on lending money, let's say the market, you might want to be out of probation. But I don't think this person asking the question is going to have any issues.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because there's this common sort of belief that you need to wait 3 months. And I hear a lot of people say that. And I always say, look, I think you should just check in with your broker because we make these assumptions. We wait because of some information that we think is correct. And then we find out that we could have gone sooner, or maybe we act too quickly and we really should have waited. So I always recommend people go to a broker.
I'll throw one extra thing in there as well, actually. So not only is it risk in terms of the bank policy and how the bank's feeling around lending, and it does change dramatically, right? It's not always the same. There also is a risk in terms of how much you're borrowing, what LVR you're doing, what type of property you're buying. So, as an overall picture, when we're trying to sell it to credit, they may say, "Well, it's a 90+ lend. It's going to LMI territory. They're on probation. It's not a great asset. Let's not lend to this situation as well." And so, if you are borrowing more sort of over 80%, up to 90% or plus, the banks are absolutely going to be more risk adverse, and they're going to want to see, hopefully, you're out of probation or, multiple pay slips, at least.
Yeah, okay. So it puts all in the context there.
Mm.
All right. The second question is, how much of a disadvantage is it to apply for a mortgage as an expat? This person is currently living temporarily in Saudi Arabia and their partner is back in Australia. Their job is helping them very much with saving for a house deposit. So they're building a nice big deposit. One's here, one's there. So what would you be suggesting in that circumstance?
Look, we actually got a couple of clients doing exactly this, living in Saudi Arabia and working. And one of my most innovative clients, to be honest, I think he's probably he's done some amazing property moves over the years, been with us maybe, 5 to 10 years, a long time. He's actually over in Saudi at the moment, right? And the issue we find with expat lending is there's so many haircuts that the banks put on it. They'll probably tax it at Australian rates. They'll haircut it for, exchange rates, etc. Not all the banks want to lend on it because it's a little bit higher risk and it's a little bit more complicated and they need more credit assessors, etc. So, but ultimately, usually you're not going to be able to borrow as much as if you were earning the same amount of income in Australia, even though, you might not be paying any tax and you might be getting rent for free, etc. So it is one of those ones that you do need to sort of run it around the banks. Like certain lenders like Heritage or CBA, HSBC. There's a number of lenders that we go to when we're looking at, expat loans. And it does depend on your LVR here a lot as well. And so, if you're borrowing more than 80% of the property value or you've got a decent deposit, that makes a big difference in expat lending, and your lender options increase dramatically. There's also been some non-banks come into. So you got your traditional banks, the big four and Macquarie and ING, et cetera. And but there's these sort of non-bank lenders that sort of get wholesale funding and then they lend it out. We've seen a bit of innovation there for expats as well. So the real answer to this question is just do the numbers. Like often with a lot of expats, they're living in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, London, etc. And what usually kills them is that you can only borrow, maybe 2, 3 times your income, and you've got this huge rental expense. And you just got to be careful, around rules around expat lending as well. And can you claim the negative gearing deductions? Does you have to pay stamp duty? It can, there's the rules around expat lending are changing a lot over the last few years. And so while you might even be able to get lending, you just got to make sure that it makes sense with a lot of the other taxes that you might have to pay, and managing your cash flow. So it's really quite tough to borrow as an expat. But if you've got a decent deposit, it does open up your options and it's worth running the numbers.
And what about an expat if you've got two people on the mortgage, one's currently living overseas and one's living in Australia? How does that work?
Look, it's going to increase your chances of getting a loan. And so maybe they can, make some tweaks with the way that they assess because they've got some money in Australia, some income in Australia. But maybe if you're running two households, it'd be good in this situation if you've got no rent over there as well. Um, and we could say, well, no, the family in Australia are self-sufficient on one income. This money's coming back, and maybe they don't have to haircut it as much. And we could maybe make a case to say it's only short term, it's only for the next 2 or 3 years. But what a bank would want to do is know that, like you said, it's only temporarily. They might want to say, well, what are you earning? It is one of those ones where we would have to try to sell it to a bank. Because, if you think about it, they've got to be conscious that they're lending money responsibly, right? So they can't say, oh, okay, you're earning 300,000 tax free in Saudi Arabia. We're going to lend you $3 million. And you come back to Australia and you're on a salary of 200,000, you got to pay tax, right? So the banks need to be careful here as well. And, on lower LVR loans, they're willing to take that risk because they're saying, well, no, we lent it in good faith. You told us this situation. But as soon as you go into sort of higher LVR lending, particularly non-banks, they don't want to take those risks.
Yeah, interesting. And I remember our interviews with Brett Kelly from Atlas Wealth, where he talked about the differences of the tax agreements with Australia in different countries. It's really complicated. So I would be suggesting never to do anything like this without getting accounting advice as well from somebody who actually
Exactly.
has got experience and a lot of experience working with expats, because you could accidentally back yourself into a situation where you're actually up for a lot of tax unnecessarily, and it might be worth just waiting till you get back. So just squirrel the money away while you're there. So get advice from an accountant as well. All right. The third question is, should I get a loan for an investment property that I'd eventually live in so I have a higher borrowing capacity and can secure a better asset, as I will have additional rental income, and forfeit my the first home buyer grants, and I don't know, there's just so many different schemes that they get access to, but they'll basically be foregoing all of those. Or should they use both grants and secure a lower grade asset that is at my current lower borrowing capacity? So let's break it into two parts here. There's obviously the assumption that more money will get them a better asset that they'll be able to move into, but there's also the assumption that by renting it out, they're going to have a higher borrowing capacity. So that's really, I think, the core of this question. And that's where I wanted you, Chris, to talk to us about that, because I know in years gone by, it was really advantageous for a lot of first home buyers to go down the rental, the investment path first, because they could borrow a lot more. But what's the situation now?
Look, it really depends on what you're doing from a living point of view. So if you're living at home, obviously you've got no rental expense. They will use a notional rent, some lenders, some won't. But the bank says, oh, you haven't got any real rent, so your living expenses are quite low as well. If you're doing it by yourself, maybe even with a partner. And then you can add the income for the investment property, and so you can borrow more money. And that might be the difference in a tight borrowing capacity environment which we are in. Sometimes that's the difference between, in this situation, getting an asset that you would never want to live in to an asset that you would want to live in. And, if the ability to buy that today versus not being able to buy it at all, and was just buying it as an investment property and potentially living at home for some time, then absolutely it can work. Coincidentally, we just had a client do this last week. They, young guy, muso, he's done really well for himself, saved a deposit, lived at home, and he actually bought an apartment on the beaches in Sydney, right? And, and it's a cracking asset. He did really well. And the reason he bought it and he's going to keep living at home, he's going to rent the apartment out, and it's absolutely something you'd be happy to live in long term. But he can't afford it now. In fairness, it's stretched. He's had to take out a bigger loan, and he had to put in a lot of his cash. He's got a negative cash flow, so he's just going to have to support that for the next few years. And then when he can financially, afford to do it, maybe a partner comes along down the line when there's two incomes. The plan is to move into that apartment. So he's got his future home locked in, but he's also got a great investment. So yeah, it absolutely can work. The issue I find though is that you've always got you can potentially increase your borrowing capacity, but if the plan is to buy it as an investment property, you increase your borrowing capacity, and ultimately you can't really ever afford it. You've got to really question whether you're just doing everything you can to get into the market and stretching your capacity. So this situation, we've got a high borrowing capacity. We bought our future home, but you just took on too much debt and you don't actually ever been able to live in it. So that would be the challenge. I mean, it's great getting some first home buyer, schemes, particularly things like the 5% deposit scheme right now is really attractive. But those limits on those schemes really make it hard to get great assets, which I think this question's sort of alluding to.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's often a great. And the only other thing I would say here is though, that if you do buy it as investment property, look, a bank can't ever say to you, look, you can't move into it. It's your asset. It's your place. They can't say, no, you told us to invest property, you can never move into it. And if you do move into
Unless
it,
you buy it on your super fund.
well, that's true. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so you can move into it. You can easily change your loan from investment to home. Some banks get a bit fiddly if you do it in the first 6 months because it looks like you've just tried to game the system. Yeah, so that's the other thing as well. A lot of people think, oh, if I bought it as an investment property, it doesn't mean I can live in it. Well, no, you can. If you can afford the mortgage, then it's an option there. And the only other thing I would finally add on that question is one of the benefits of buying a home is it grows tax free. And so if you do buy it as an investment property, it means that you're probably going to pay capital gains tax when you sell it one day. But if it's only going to be an investment property for 2 or 3 years, and it's while you get on your feet, while you get ahead of your cash flow, and then you're going to move into it, then what's a couple of years of growth if you're going to hold it for 5-10 years plus? I wouldn't be too concerned.
Yeah, I mean, and that is something, obviously, I see it a lot where people choose rent vesting, but then but they buy an investment that nowhere near where they want to live or nowhere near big enough for them to live in. And then when they are in a position where they want to buy a home, that actual investment becomes a problem, because then they have to sell it and then they have to pay tax on the gain. And if they bought something smaller to live in, they would have been better off. But if you are buying and you can see that your income is going to increase in the future, so you'll be able to manage it, or if you would rent out the other room, or if potentially you would intend to partner, then absolutely, I can see what you're saying there, Chris. Excellent. Okay, the fourth question we have is, my partner and my potential loan allows us to only just break into the area we want to live in. Is using future rental income, that means if we rent out rooms as a share house scenario, a good option to boost our loan so that we can afford a better asset? So it's sort of along the lines of the last question, except these people actually want to have the cake and eat it too. They want to live in it and make an investment property. And I'm not sure whether you can factor that sort of spare room rent into your loan calcs. Can you, is the question.
No, I mean, the banks won't want to lend you that because they'll want to see leases and all that sort of stuff. And then is it a home or an investment? I think you're just going to have to forget about that one. But I think part of our last question was, do you just buy it as an investment property? And if that means your way to get into, not just break into the area, but not buy the D grade assets, right? And potentially get something a little bit better than you could have got if you just bought it as a home. And then you just go rent something really cheap for a few years, and then you move into it. So that would be, if you're running it that tight, I would consider that option. Secondly, I would go, well, look, if I personally, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, Veronica, is I'd probably prefer, instead of getting a C or a D in the suburb, probably just go a suburb or two out and get a B, get a better asset in a suburb that's not as good than a poorer asset in a better suburb. I think ultimately a lot of gentrification happens. That suburb, becomes almost just as good if it's like for like, and you're talking like a bridesmaid suburb. And I do think you'll enjoy living in the property more versus the CD. And then ultimately, when you sell it one day, I think you would probably get better growth. Do you agree with that, Veronica? Rather than getting the bottom end, just maybe move a suburb and get a better property?
Yeah, I do. I really do think that there's too much focus on location. And yes, location is very important, right? But I think that, there's the ripple effect does work. And I do think a better caliber house or apartment in a neighbouring suburb or 2 suburbs down the line is going to be long-term a better proposition than sort of a crappy apartment or a crappy house on a crappy street in a great suburb. And I've seen it. I've seen it in blue chip suburbs where really poor assets. I've seen people actually lose money in blue chip suburbs, and that sort of goes against what people seem to think can happen, because they've gone and made those really poor asset choices. And I think too, when you think about it, and I've done some really light on research on this. I really couldn't say it's robust, but I have looked at the sorts of properties that change hands more often versus those that actually are, tightly held. And properties that are tightly held are easy to live in. They're well connected. They're great. They're well located in terms of what they're located close to, but they're easy to live in. Cold houses are not easy to live in. Noisy houses, not easy to live in, And so I think we do, and it's something too small to be functional, not easy to live in. So I think that you sort of see a lot more churn in those sort of substandard properties, and that churn actually adds cost because you're not generally growing in value at the same rate. So you're copying it in terms of lost opportunity and capital growth, and then you're copying it in terms of transaction costs as well. So I think that it's always a good idea to aim for a quality asset. Now, back to this particular question, these people are trying to get a better asset where their budget is hamstrung. So I agree with what you're saying there, is to look at a different suburb rather than trying to game the system and trying to get more than you can really afford. But I would also say that using your principal place of residence to produce income can also create tax implications down the track, even if you rent out one room. So I think that I'm talking about capital gains tax as well as potentially income tax. So again, if anyone is able to afford a bigger house and they're thinking, okay, well, I am going to rent out the second room, then you need to get some good tax advice from an accountant on that as well. So there's always sort of implications. Any sort of freebie you feel like you're getting now, there's usually some payback down the track.
Yeah, and I think if you are in that situation where you think, oh, look, I'm going to get this mortgage, but I'm going to have to rent out a bunch of rooms, I wonder whether it doesn't mean you shouldn't buy it, but maybe you should buy it, live in it for 6 months, tidy the property up. If the mortgage is going to be too much, and interest rates aren't always going to be where they are, right? They're going to change, right? Whether they go up or down, they're not going to be where they are now forever. And let's say if they do go back down, then living in that property is going to get cheaper, right? Your mortgage repayments are going to get cheaper. So you may say, well, under 6% interest rates, buying now, living in it for 6 months is going to get me in the market, but it's going to be too tight on our cash flow. So what we're going to do is rent it out. We're going to negative gear the property, and then go and rent something quite cheap just for the next few years while interest rates are higher. Then when rates go down and income goes up, or maybe you get through the baby stage or whatever it might be, then move into the property. And so rather than not being in the market or just buying something that's going to suit you for a short runway, buy something that's going to suit you long term, even though it's a stretch. Move into something cheaper to rent. I know there's a bit of hassle there. I know it's stressful switching properties and things like that, but maybe it's a lot less stressful to live in, buy the house, then move into an apartment and just suck it up in the apartment for a couple of years. Maybe that is a lot less stress than trying to maintain a house that you can't afford under higher interest rates. And so I think sometimes people get too attached to not moving, and they just go and have to deal with all this pain when a simple move could solve the numbers. Because yes, it's a rental crisis for you renting, but it's also a rental crisis for what you're renting out. So you're probably going to rent your place out pretty well. And then, and if you live, go quite simple because it's, not going to live there for long, and make quite a few compromises, you should be able to get a rental property just for a few years. And you always got the option to move back into your other house when you can afford it.
Now, our fifth question is this one. So it sort of links back into the first question. I saved a deposit for my first home. Let's say 20% of an average Adelaide house. So that's pretty good deposit. I'm switching career and studying diploma in nursing, and so will my wife next year, same career. Should I wait for my study to finish or start looking for a house? I want to put my money to work. So this is someone who's got the deposit. They're currently working full time and they're going to start studying. So, there's a whole affordability around how much pressure you want to put on yourself when you're a full-time student as well, I would imagine, too, and paying the mortgage. But how would you advise a client under those circumstances, Chris?
Look, it's an interesting one. I guess it depends on how long it's going to take for you to be able to enter the market again. And so is it going to be 3 years to study? Is it 5 years? And being realistic around that. And then there's potentially an opportunity cost where if you didn't act today, then, you're going to potentially buy at prices, 3, 7 years down the line or whatever it might be. I mean, we just had an episode on Adelaide, and Adelaide's had a pretty good run. So you wouldn't, it doesn't mean you shouldn't buy because it's just had a run, but I think you just got to be aware of that opportunity cost, which is why you asked the question, right? Like you're sort of aware of that. The challenge here, though, is if you go and I'd be really strategic on how you structured your loan. A lot of people go, I don't want to pay lender's mortgage insurance, and I've got my 20%. And all of a sudden they go from a cash, feeling safe and secure because they've got a buffer, and they put it all into a property and they've got nothing left just to avoid paying lender's mortgage insurance. So if it was me, I would potentially be open to pay lender's mortgage insurance. I'd explore the 5% deposit scheme, and I'd try to keep as much cash as I could back. Just to get you through this study so you can still finish what you need to there. You can afford your mortgage. And I'd try to keep your costs really low as you're studying, right? But and I'll also probably buy something that, does need a lot of work, like reduce your purchase price rather than a fully renovated place. Maybe just buy something that structurally is really good and you can renovate it down the line, because that'll also reduce your mortgage as well. So while your cash flow is going to be tight over the next few years, just buy something that's, pretty just livable, maybe not going to be a bit of a money pit, not a lot of things you got to fix over the next 3 to 5 years, but it's totally fine for another 5 years. And that reduces your purchase price. So when you get into your nursing, a few years into that, then you can look to sort of do a renovation. But a lot of people don't want to make those compromises. Just this week, I was having those same conversations with a couple of clients, and I think potentially in this market as well, where unrenovated places are going at a discount, it's something under higher interest rates. More people should be thinking about, even though there's time and cost and building costs are high. I think it's probably not a bad decision for some people.
I want to pick up, there's two little tangents I want to go down on this one. One is buffers. We'll come back to that though. Let's talk about that unrenovated property option, particularly for first home buyers, but also for upgraders. And it's sort of interesting because what I see in the marketplace, like for example, in Sydney, and my understanding is in Melbourne at the moment, the two less hot markets in terms of capital city markets in this country, the unrenovated properties are not going gangbusters. They're not getting highly competitive. So they are actually representing some good value if you can get one with good bones. So what I say there, it's got to be well maintained, can be dated, it can have some floor plan issues you need to move around, potentially extend at some point of time, but fundamentally the bone, it's got good bones and it's in good condition. So even though it's dated, you're not going to hate living it because it's not going to be a slum. But and so there are opportunities in some of those markets, but Megan in Brisbane, for example, would be saying that, well, actually unrenovated properties up there are disproportionately more competitive because that's when a hot market, that's where people fight to get into the market. And that's a compromise they make, is to buy unrenovated. And we've seen that happen in Sydney as well, where the gap between the renovated and the unrenovated is nowhere near what it would cost to take that renovated to the same standard as the unrenovated property. And so that's something you've got to be really careful of. But certainly first home buyers, the opportunity for that is looking at the conditions, the market conditions at the time. Currently in Adelaide, that's where this person is looking at buying. Unrenovated may not represent great opportunity.
Good point.
And so, you've got to be sort of super careful. I love the Nana's houses. They're sort of seen as they're dated, but not unrenovated, but they really are unrenovated. They're just a bit daggy. Daggy is good. Daggy, we love daggy. So that's sort of the first thing I would say there, that the opportunities presented by renovating are market dependent. And certainly if you get something that is in really great condition, it gives you time to take your time to finish your studies and then start to actually do the work to it, as opposed to something that's diabolical, like the house I currently live in. When I bought that, it got too diabolical and needed intervention, before I was ready to do the full renovation. And that was cost that was blown, because I had to spend it. I had no option. So these are things to obviously consider when you're renovating. But the other thing, let's talk a bit more about buffers, particularly for first home buyers, but not just for first home buyers. We've seen, 14 interest rate rises that we'd had, to get to the point where we are at the moment. Anybody with good buffers obviously felt a lot safer, and obviously anyone who'd fixed their rates for a long period of time also felt pretty safe in that over that period of time. But buffers are important, right? And I love that you mentioned about, potentially paying LMI to give you that sort of freedom. So can we talk a bit more about, because a lot of us, particularly first home buyers, will sort of enter in thinking, I don't want that debt. I want to get that debt paid as soon as possible. But borrowing strategy and being clever about how you structure your finance can buy you time. It could buy you flexibility. So give some more context to that if you can.
Yeah, I always laugh when people say how many interest rate increases, because the media always talks about how many times did they actually increase the rates, but they forget that a lot of them were actually doubles. So it was actually like 17 interest rate increases
at 25%.
At points. Yeah, exactly. And it's every time you see it in the media, it's always wrong. And I always just sort of laugh. I've never seen someone actually count the actual 0.25 increases. Not to say they always have to be 0.25. So that would be people's arguments, is that they don't have to be 0.25. They can, change it at different rates. But if you add it at 0.25. Now, the buffer is an interesting one, right? So lenders mortgage insurance, there's a lot of misunderstanding of how it works, how expensive it is, etc. So I guess learning about it is probably the first thing. It's not some fee that as soon as you borrow over 80%, it's this flat fee, no matter what size loan you're taking, no matter what percentage. It's sort of like an exponential curve. It gets more expensive. Between 80 and 86%, yeah, it's expensive, but it's, maybe only 1% of whatever your loan is, right? 86 to 88, it gets a little bit more expensive, but not too bad. 88 to 90% starts to jump up, right? And so we always try to get to 88% loans if we can. At 90%, it gets a fair whack more expensive than 88. And then over 90%, it gets quite expensive. So it goes from maybe, 1.5 to 2% of the loan to sort of maybe 3 or 4% of the loan. And as you get maybe up to 95%, it could be 4 plus, right? So what you want to do with LMI is try to get it down to sort of that 1.5, 2% zone, which is borrowing around sort of the 90% mark, or ideally at 88%. And so what you say is, well, I'm paying this little bit at this cost, so let's say 1.5% of my loan. Let's say you're borrowing, I don't know, let's say $1 million property, and you're borrowing 88% on that is 880,000. What the lender's mortgage insurance might be is 15,000. It might be 16,000 or 17,000. And for that, you only have to put in a 12% deposit versus a 20% deposit. So in this situation, you only have to put in 120 grand deposit versus a 200 grand deposit. So you're going to have 80 grand more cash if you go for an 88% loan than an 80% loan.
So that's assuming that you've actually got 20% deposit, right?
Exactly.
If you don't, you still might take advantage of LMI to get into the market, but you're not going to have a buffer, are you?
Well, that's right. So if you only just could get the 20% deposit plus stamp duty here, which is say 50 grand. So, if you to get in $1 million, you need 250 to avoid mortgage insurance, 200 for the deposit, 50 grand for stamp duty. If you go in at 88% or 90%, maybe you need 150 to 170 grand, right? So it's a big difference. But even if you had, say, I don't know, 220 or 230, you might say, well, instead of going for an 84% loan, what I might do is go for a 90% loan or an 88% loan, pay a little bit more mortgage insurance, not a ridiculous amount, and keep 30, 40 grand left over. So you use it as a bit of a tool to give you a buffer. Now, people say, oh, well, that means you're going to pay more interest. Well, yeah, it does, because you're going to have a higher loan, but the money you've got left over, you're going to put into an offset account. And so your net loan is going to be quite similar. The only difference is the extra amount you pay for mortgage insurance. And so don't be afraid to look at mortgage insurance, particularly when you're running it tight and it's your first home. And because there's always a danger zone when you buy a property. You go from feeling rich and I've got heaps of money in my savings account, if something goes wrong, to, I've got nothing. If something went wrong with the property or work or health, or, you just want to give yourself that buffer. And so that's how LMI works.
Do you ever see people, when they're upgrading, take advantage of or make use of LMI?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because ultimately, you think you're never going to have to pay it again, and then you go to upgrade, and you're like, I bought it $1 million. Now I want to go to $2 million. Well, now I need 500 grand for a deposit. My first property's only gone up a little bit, and actually work's gone better than I thought, and I can maybe upgrade earlier than I thought. But I've only got 400 grand, or I've got 500, I've got 550. Maybe we should pay a bit of lender's mortgage insurance. Absolutely. It's not just first home buyers, particularly for investors. They can get it wrong here, because a lot of investors go, well, I release up to 80% on the value of my property and I'll buy at 80% on the investment property. And they go on, whatever that number is, they go on spend. But if they just were a little bit smarter and said they could release up to 90% on their home, that's often not what we do. But they could buy their investment property at 88 or 90% loan to value ratio. And LMI is actually tax deductible over 5 years. It's seen as a borrowing cost. So, by avoiding it at all costs, you go, well, I'll buy at 600 versus buying at 900 to avoid LMI. But then LMI wouldn't have been that bad, and it would have been deductible, and you would have got yourself a better asset. Was it really worthwhile trying to avoid LMI? And secondly, you can potentially, by using LMI, put in less deposit, which means you've got more buffer, which means you could potentially buy other investments or shares or things like that. And so, really understand how to use it.
So I guess, and again, it's about having a good mortgage broker who can talk about borrowing strategy with you, but also it's thinking about it. In a way, it's an insurance policy. So you're almost self-insuring, by allowing yourself to have that buffer, but you're also giving yourself options which you would not have if you actually tied that all the way in your mortgage. Another question, around this, the federal government's home loan, I can never remember the name of this, the deposit guarantee, right? The 5% deposit guarantee. So I guess if you qualify for that and you've got the income and you're also buying under the threshold, because it taps out, there's an income threshold, there's also a purchase price threshold. But you could see, do people who have more than 5% take advantage of that and keep the extra money somehow separate and then put it in an offset? Do you see that happening?
Yeah, look, I think they are clamping down on this a little bit. Though when they first came out, they were like, "Oh, if you want 5%, 5%," and but they are getting tighter and tighter. Looking at what cash you've got, they will give you a buffer. But let's say you've got a 30% deposit and you want a 5% deposit home loan, then they are looking at that and going, "Really, should you qualify for this?" There's only 10,000 places, etc. I forget exactly how the banks are looking at right now, and different banks, because they get sort of allocations. It's sort of like, well, who's got allocation left, and what's their policy on this? And more of the building societies, because they do get spread around those 10,000 places. And when you go off the bigger banks to these more building societies, they get a little bit more focused on making sure that you're not abusing the policy, right? But yeah, you're right. There's an income cap. It's like 120,000 for a single, I think, and 200,000 for a couple. And there's city and state-based limits in terms of what you can spend, but it's FL, First Home Loan Deposit Scheme. So that's
Yes.
it is a funny name and
FLH.
could be shorter. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Now, to wrap this episode up, you know how we always have a dumbo, and I haven't actually prepared you for this, but I'm going to ask you, do you have a first home buyer property dumbo for us?
Look, I think yeah, I mean, obviously there's thousands of clients that we've spoken to over the years. Look, I do think, unfortunately, it's people who go down the property investment route first.
Mm.
There's a client just recently, we were chatting about this on, he's a new client of ours and we are doing the loan, but we heavily advised them not to use a certain buyer's agent, and they still went down that route, fell for the marketing online,
Mm-hmm.
and they did buy. And to be honest, it's not a great asset. And I think that's the frustrating thing. I mean, we have advised them, and we've been very transparent that we wouldn't work with them and ask for feedback. So I think that's the one. I think that they are so good at their marketing, and they unfortunately fall for it. And so that the other thing with first home buyers is probably listening to friends and family a little bit too much as well, and just trying to rush it. I think, and they're basically just trying to get into the market. They're not listening to sort of independent advice, and they're just following what their friends are doing. And I think that's a big mistake. They're also buying for their current needs, not their future needs. I
Mm.
think, I can't rent anymore. I'm over it. And I'm just can't do it anymore. And I'm just doing it. I need my own place. Okay, well, okay, I get it, but that doesn't mean you should just buy anything to live in. I've seen absolutely a lot of people fall for the offer plan. I remember a girl a few years ago that we tried it. She was so close to getting an amazing place in Randwick. And all of a sudden, she missed out by a whisker. And all of a sudden, a friend had got, selling some new development around Rosebery. And then all of a sudden,
Oh.
she signed up.
Mm.
And so I think that's another mistake is they just get buyer fatigue. A lot of people, they just get first home buyer mistakes are property bears as well. They,
Mm.
they drink that Kool-Aid, and
Yep.
that's another big mistake. And
It's they're arguing. It's like they're fighting the market. It's like, that's crazy. Prices are crazy. That's insane. I'm not going to play a part in this. And they fight it for years. They might never get in, or they might finally get in at a much lower point in the market that they could have if they'd actually bitten the bullet and just accepted the reality of what the market is at some earlier point. So yeah, we see that too. And the off the plan thing is quite tragic for first home buyers because, Megan and I have a mantra, which is if it's hard to buy, then it's easy to sell.
Yep.
And if it's easier to sell, it's going to be hard to, it's easy to buy, it's going to be hard to sell. And the temptation for a lot of people is to avoid competition. And if you do miss out and you lick your wounds and it's really painful, and then you say, oh, it's easy to buy this off the plan. I don't even have to think about it. I don't even have to have all the money at the moment. And I could just park it. And then down the track, then I'll worry about it. But that's real delayed pain. And we've seen so many people that have really struggled the ownership process has not been pleasant because of defects and all sorts of stuff that can sometimes go wrong. But then if they go to sell, and we know that that's the highest segment of the market that actually loses money is the first time resale on off the plan property. So it's a real trap for first home buyers. And I know Megan and I in particular are just like at war trying to fight that battles and less people fall into it. And I know you're on the same path there. All right. Well, thank you, Chris, because these are questions that I think that we can't, Megan and I couldn't tackle them in the Facebook group. We could just say, go and find a good broker. So I thought, well, I'm going to go to a good broker and ask the questions. So thank you. And hope the listeners enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. Talk soon.
That was so good, getting those finance answers from Chris. I hope you all got a lot out of them. You can really hear why it's so important to get a good mortgage broker as part of your support crew.
And these questions all came from our Facebook group. Have you joined yet? It's called Your First Home Buyer Guide Australia, and it's your opportunity to connect with us and ask your questions. Now, you will get answers from us and also from experts when we can't answer them, which means that you can be sure you're not going to get led down the garden path.
Now, a quick note, you might think that we cover everything you need to know in these podcasts, but a word of warning, we don't. We just scratch the surface here. There's not enough time. If you really want to be an educated first home buyer, you need to learn all of the steps and how to do everything in the right order.
Our First Home Buyer Guide course only costs $990. I mean, I know it's a lot of money, but it's a tiny amount of money given the risks that you're taking when you're buying a property. And you do get direct access to us to help guide you through your negotiations. You can also share the link of any property that you were thinking of buying, and we can help you work out whether it's A, B, C grade or a no-go zone. Trust me, you will buy better with a hell of a lot more confidence with our guidance, and you will overpay a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out Your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.